I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. Today I want to talk with you about the structure of Exodus chapters 19 through 24. Again, if you're interested in the overarching structure of the book of Exodus, you can go and find another video called The Survey of the Book of the Exodus, where you can see the entire book laid out. So this is just going to be a deep dive into a particular section. This is the material where Israel originally gets to Sinai and where they receive the Ten Commandments, and then also a block of laws called the Book of the Covenant. Then from 25 through 40, Moses goes back up the mountain and receives the instructions for the tabernacle, both how it's to be constructed, and then you also then get an account, chapters 35 to 40, about the actual building of it. And then in the middle, 32 to 34, you have the golden calf. So this is the beginning of the Sinai materials. And big picture, remember that Israel at Sinai is the center of the entire Pentateuch from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and essentially Israel is at Sinai, or Mount Horeb if you will, from Exodus 19:1 all the way through Numbers 10:10. So this is literally the whole center of the Pentateuch. So you want to remember that as we think about this. So this is the opening section, and this is going to work through in a couple of different movements. So we have Exodus 19, and this breaks up into two phrases too. If you have your scriptures, take a look at Exodus chapter 19, and take a look at the third verse or the fourth verse. This is a lot of this preliminary, but notice verse 4. It says, "You yourselves have seen." So we have Exodus 19:4, "You yourselves have seen." Okay, then I also want you to take a look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 22. It's very similar. "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this." You can go back and look at verse 3 to see the same kind of phrase right before we get to "you yourselves have seen." Chapter 20, verse 22, "You yourselves have seen." So we're going to have this repeated at 20:22. So this gives us some structural markers. And what this does then is it connects two things. If we're going to break this up into a couple of units, we can essentially argue that 19:1 through 2 serves essentially as an introduction. It gets Israel to Sinai. And then we have 19:3 through 20:21. And this material is going to include, as we'll see, a theological prologue synthesis, if you will. And then we're also going to get, beginning at chapter 20, verses 1 through 21, we're going to get the giving of the Ten Commandments. Now I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me step back here and go back and look at the core passage that we want to look at in this section is going to be 19:3 to 6. And this section essentially lays out in programmatic fashion. So this is going to be, if you're no rhetorical structures, this entire passage is going to move from the general to the more specific to the most specific. And so what we have here is a general statement that I'm calling a theological synthesis, where basically we have a report about grace. You have seen for yourselves what I did to Egypt, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So that's God's people's experience of grace. Now, how do you respond to grace? Well, Exodus 19, 3-6 is going to talk about a response to grace in terms of living out the response of grace in relationship to God via covenant, which is going to involve obeying or truly listening to my voice, to God's voice, and keeping my covenant. Now, what's it mean to listen and to keep? It involves listening to God's voice and then keeping. Go back to Genesis chapter 26. This is where God gives Isaac the same promises that he's given to Abraham. Again, Abraham's promises were in chapter 12, chapter 17, several different places God makes certain promises to Abraham, but to Isaac they're received in chapter 26. And after essentially extending the Abrahamic promises to Isaac, God adds, because Abraham listened and kept. It's going to be the same phrases. So this is going to be the language of faithfulness, right? And so what's the response to God's grace? It's going to be faithfulness. So a big part of Israel at Sinai is learning about covenant, which involves faithfulness on the part of God's people. And that's all in response to grace, which in the book of Exodus, just to put the finger on this, what is the act of grace? It's the exodus from Egypt, which also includes God bringing God's people to Sinai. So don't miss this. This is a response to grace. Now, what else is unpacked here? Not only do they get the covenant, but also what we get to see here are two things. We get to see the identity. God's people take on a particular identity. And if you're interested in a deep dive onto this section, take a look at my videos on Exodus 19, 3-6. But we get an identity here. God's people are God's treasured possession. So they may have been Pharaoh's slaves, but for God, God's people are God's treasured possession. And then they have a particular vocation. They're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Right? And so God's people are going to be a kingdom of priests. So they're going to be a kingdom, a nation. They're going to be priests, and they're going to be holy. So just notice those three pieces. God's people are a community. They're a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, kingdom, nation. They're priests. What do priests do? Priests connect people to God, and Israel as a whole is going to function as a conduit of God's grace to the nations. So they're going to have a mission. You might look at it this way. We're going to have in Exodus, we're going to have the tabernacle at the center, right? Which really is what? God at the center. That's Yahweh. His Shekinah glory comes down in the last paragraph of the book of Exodus and fills the tabernacle. But then how does this frame out then? Then we have Israel is encamped around the tabernacle. So Israel has unique access to God But then, what's the point? Israel exists among the nations. And a real emphasis in this section is out of all the peoples on earth, out of all the nations, the earth is God's. God picks Israel. And so Israel then, the nations, this is why it's so important for God's people to be holy. The nations find out about who God is based on the character of God's people. And that's where holiness is. Holiness, so we have a community, a mission, and holiness as character is a critical piece. So that's all up here in 19:3-6. This is what I'm calling a general statement. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw what looks like a gigantic greater than sign. But what this illustrates is that this is going to move from general to specifics. This is critical for understanding the structure of Exodus 19-24. So you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And then in the rest of Exodus 19, we have this powerful theophany where God comes down and there's fire and smoke and God's people prepare themselves for the Lord. But then in chapter 20, we get the 10 Commandments. Now, notice how chapter 20 starts. It says, and God spoke all these words. So God is actually speaking audibly at Sinai. And what the 10 Commandments give, they start out with verse 2. They again remind God's people about grace. So this is all about the Exodus, right? So I am Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So notice how closely verse 2 essentially relates back to Exodus 4 with the report about grace. You have seen for yourselves. So these two things are connected. And then we get the 10 Commandments. And they break down basically into two sets, right? We have commandments about loving God, and there'll be no other gods before you, no images, no taking the Lord's name in vain. And then we have a whole block of commandments that go from honoring your father, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, and don't covet, which have to do with really loving neighbor. And then in the middle, I did skip one, you may have noticed, we have the Sabbath commandment that essentially connects both of these things together. Okay, so that takes us through Exodus 21-17. So you want to see, in a sense, that what the 10 Commandments do, and this is where I'm talking about moving from general to specific. Exodus 19 just talks about listening to God's voice, keeping the covenant. Well, in this case, here's God actually speaking audibly. So what does it look like to keep covenant, to hear God's voice? It involves keeping the 10 Commandments, which are a more specific distillation of what covenant is. So we have these 10 words as guides. Okay, so the question then arises, okay, how do we understand what comes afterwards? So again, 2022, all the way through chapter 24, through chapter 23 to start with. We'll go all the way through 24:18. And specifically, we have two things. 2022 through 23:33 is what's known as the Book of the Covenant. And then chapter 24, God's people actually ratify covenant, or they cut the covenant. There's witnesses, they go back up on Sinai. And what the Book of the Covenant does is unlike the Ten Commandments, which are short statements that give direct reflection on what obedience looks like, what we have in this section, these are the more difficult laws. These are where you get specific things like what to do if your ox gores someone. One of my favorites is don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Talks about how to treat the stranger that's in your midst. There's, in fact, the first two laws are about how to build an altar and also how to treat slaves. Again, we'll say more about that as we move a little further into Exodus, but isn't it interesting that the first two laws that we see in the Book of the Covenant about altar, how to love God, and then there's a block on slavery, and you're thinking, what does laws on slavery, how does that fit into the book of Exodus? Well, one of the things we'll just say to introduce that is, what's a more marginalized person than a slave? And we talk about loving neighbor, and we'll see that right up front. Again, it's going to be chapter 21, the first two laws, how to build an altar, how to treat slaves. And we're going to see that God extends protections to a people that could have easily been abused. Again, we'll say more about that in coming weeks. But what the Book of the Covenant then does is it takes the general, the slightly more specific Ten Commandments, and I would suggest that it operationalizes the Ten Commandments. And what I mean by operationalize is they give specific examples of how the Ten Commandments would be applied contextually and specifically in the context here. And so what we have is a model then of ethical reflection. We're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation that keeps God's covenant. Well, okay, what does that look like? Well, it's going to involve loving God, loving neighbor through applying the Ten Commandments. Okay, what does it look like specifically to love God and love neighbor in my context? Well, the Book of the Covenant serves as a model, a paradigm for how you could apply the Ten Commandments into a specific context. Now, again, this is a hard section to read because, again, like we can joke and say we never break these. Like, for example, I don't own an ox, so I couldn't possibly break that rule, right? But, well, wrong. There's a deeper principle under there that points back to the Ten Commandments, so we can learn about how to contextualize the Ten Commandments into our context by seeing how at Sinai God initially helped Israel to contextualize the Ten Commandments for their context. And then, of course, the last thing that happens is Israel agrees. And so, in a sense, we have a climax of this because Israel essentially agrees to keep the commands. Anyway, this is an introduction to this whole section here. But again, remember, the purpose of the law is missional. It's to help create a people who can reflect to the nations God's character. So what does it look like to live with a holy God in your midst? It's going to look like the Ten Commandments as specifically applied through the Book of the Covenant. Again, we'll say more. Go ahead and continue to watch the videos. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments. You can put them in, if you're in my Exodus class, put them in the discussion board. And again, I'm Brian Russell. It's my privilege to be your instructor. Thanks for listening.